Good evening. It's President's Day in the United States, and you're now looking at the United West studios. This is where we typically bring you webinars and radio programs. That chair is the chair for Tom Trento, our director, and we're very, very grateful for your continued interest in what we do in terms of content delivery. Tonight, it's a webinar, a special webinar we do on Monday nights. It's called News Analysis, and we're very honored to have every other Monday. And tonight, Christine Douglas Williams. Good evening, Christine.
Good evening. Such a pleasure to be with you again, Dick.
It's really important for all of us to be able to pick our way through the fake news and the way we get distracted all day with the incredibly unimportant and untrue things that come our way. And these webinars, particularly the Monday night webinars, are an opportunity to focus on news and clear analysis with clear thinkers, and we're very, very grateful to do that. So tonight, Christine is going to take us through her observations about the news. We'll have question and answers with Mary joining us again. If you're new, you look down the bottom, you see a Q&A button, you put your question in, and Mary will bring those questions to Christine at the end of our program. So with that, we'll turn it over to Christine Douglas Williams.
Well, thank you, Dick, and thank you for all of us who are tuning in as well. We know that today is a holiday, so it's an extra special one for you, so we really appreciate you tuning in. And over here in Canada, it's also a special family day in Canada, so it's a holiday here as well. Now today, I'm going to be focusing on what's kind of a part two to what we discussed a couple of weeks ago. Beware the Northern Border is what we titled it. Now, most of my focus today is going to be about what's going on in Canada, but at the same time, at the end of that, I'm just going to give a couple of more stories that we'll touch on, just as a general broad range. Let me tell you a little bit about myself before I start. Many of you already know me, but I'll discuss for those who are just tuning in and may not know me. Now, a little review. I'm an international award-winning broadcast journalist and a regular writer for Jihad Watch, which is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I'm also an associate editor for Front Page magazine, the author of the book called The Challenge of Modernizing Islam, published by Encounter Books, and author of Fired by the Government of Canada for Criticizing Islam, published by the Center for Security Policy. Now, right into what we're talking about today. I'm going to go to our first story. Beware, the Government of Canada warns a well-known conservative Catholic website called LifeSite News. Now, the title of that article is, Trudeau is called, quote, the most dangerous man in Canadian political history for his plan to regulate online news. It begins. Warnings continue to multiply over the insane and invasive report that recommends Canada's Liberal government register and regulate internet media content providers. Now, last week I touched on this. I mentioned it, that our Heritage Minister in Canada, MP Stephen Guilbeault, announced an unprecedented plan to regulate the internet following a Broadcasting and Telecommunications Legislative Review Panel's report. The Liberal government assembled this panel of broadcasting experts tasked with advising the Liberals on overhauling the country's already strict broadcasting laws. A key recommendation, the report says, was to extend licenses currently granted to radio and television stations to all media content, along with a much stricter compliance regime. LifeSite News indicates, indeed so strict is this proposed scheme that two former CRTC members, now CRTC in Canada stands for Canada's broadcast regulator, the Canadian Radio Television Telecommunication Commission, and they're among, believe it or not, even two of those critics are among the report's fiercest critics. But no one's connecting the dots. Recall the $23 million follow-up of anti-Islamophobia Motion M103 in Canada. I've gone through that in the past. Many of you have heard about it and heard me talk about it. Now, this follow-up action plan was called, quote, taking action against systemic racism and religious discrimination, which includes Islamophobia. In this document, Islamophobia is repeatedly referred to as racial discrimination. But the document, among other things, promises to monitor citizens for compliance, It also talks about cracking down on Islamophobia and training law enforcement to investigate online and offline hate speech. The document says verbatim, the government of Canada also recognizes that the effectiveness of these hate speech laws requires law enforcement agencies to have training, preparedness, and capacity to report and investigate hate crimes, both offline and in the cyber domain, unquote. Interesting to note that CARE-CAN, which was renamed the National Council of Canadian Muslims, now we know that this is an offshoot of CARE in America, described as an unindicted co-conspirator to jihad terror, and also IRFAN. Those are the two groups that have also been identified by MP Iqra Khalid. Now, she was the one that tabled M103, and they've been identified, those two groups, to actually help out with the training. It's also worthwhile noting that the last conservative government that was in power outlawed pretty much IRFAN, designating it a group of concern when it comes to its links to jihad terror. Canada's focus under the Trudeau government is on targeting speech that's offensive to Islam. But think about this for a moment. What about serious incidents of hate that threatens the Jewish people and Israel, particularly on campuses and at Al-Quds Day rallies in particular? Now, the Globe and Mail described the Heritage Minister's announcement about that strict government regulation as, quote, breathtaking, a regulatory power grab. The Globe and Mail goes on to say, without precedent, either in Canada or in the democratic world. Nobody else is proposing anything like it, and for good reason, because it's insane, unquote. Now, the Globe and Mail in Canada is recognized, in fact, by most people as a leftist newspaper, and this is what the Globe and Mail actually said about that particular regulation. Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault, that first endorsed the plan, as I mentioned, on February 3rd, afterward, after a firestorm that he clearly did not expect, he went back and had the audacity to tell people openly that in an immediate press conference, that they misunderstood. And then he insisted that the Liberals won't license internet news or regulate the internet news after all. Isn't that interesting? Now, it seems to have disappeared, and for now, there is dead silence on the issue. But the frightening question is this: what would the government of Canada do if let alone? The LifeSite report then revisits the $600 million media bailout right after the October elections to those media that were chosen by the Liberals. And in my last talk to you, I also went over some of the Trudeau spending to control the media. Some recap examples: Trudeau spent over $13.6 million on sponsored social media posts, along with an estimated $675 million in funding for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, better known as CBC, in 2016. Now, a note to Americans about Canada and free speech. There are many questions that come from America asking, do you guys have a First Amendment? Well, in Canada, we don't have that First Amendment as Americans know it, but Canada does have freedom of speech under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it's kind of a variation of what you guys have in the States. In Canada, though, there are laws against hate speech, which includes hate propaganda, including advocating genocide. So it's pretty clear what hate speech is in Canada. In fact, hate speech has always been a law in Canada generally, ever since the Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into being. And what the intent of that was to really make sure that you don't have any specific group that's just targeted specifically because of a difference. There were times where people couldn't get jobs because of their race, or they couldn't get employment because of their race, and it was blatant, it was bizarre, and you can't come out, for instance, and start advocating genocide against a group. So when you look at Canada's hate laws, it's really intended to be freedom of speech with responsibility. That was the intent. But under the Liberal government, under those what you call far leftists that are drifting more and more towards socialism, starting to look like Marxism in some ways, is that you have an abuse of what this hate actually means. You now have organizations that have been connected to Islamist organizations in the Muslim Brotherhood, misusing what hate means to say that because you call out issues of jihad terror, because you talk about, let's say, the persecution of Christians that are being done in the name of Islam, or you talk about ISIS fighters who were abusing the Yazidi girls and raping them, and before they did so, they were invoking the Quran and they were saying prayers before they did it. Even on 9/11, prayers were being said from the Quran on before this took place. This is the kind of a thing that's going on, and it's being done in the name of Islam. And not all Muslims, I keep saying this, and I shouldn't even have to, it should be obvious. We do not mean all Muslims when we say these things, but because when we look at the behavior of Al-Qaeda and groups like ISIS, and they're invoking passages in the Hadiths and the Sunnah and in the Quran, this is cause for concern because there are those doing it. When you go back to the Second World War and you see what the Nazis did, we're not indicting all Germans, but the Nazis, yes. Some people say as much as 10% of the Islamic population in the world ascribes to jihad. That's an awful lot of people, tens of millions, and there needs to be concern about it. Nobody needs to be concerned about Muslims who ascribe peace and want to live peaceably and honor pluralism and the tenets of democracy when they move to democratic countries. But we do have to be concerned about another tenet of Islam that divides the world in two, the house of war and the house of Islam, Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, and I've talked about this too, where the house of war, Dar al-Harb, under Islamic supremacists, their goal is to take that house, meaning disbelieving countries, and subjugate them and turn them into Islamic believing countries. This is very real. Documents like the Muslim Brotherhood Plan for North America have been discovered. They've been entered into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trials. This isn't something that people pulled out of some jar. This is something that is real. It's documented. It's very real. And the evidence is in Islamic states, as well as the persecution of minorities, as well as what we're seeing globally when it comes to the abuses. Even FGM has become so out of control in Western countries, female genital mutilation, because that is a practice that is described quite extensively in Reliance of the Traveler, and it's even in the Hadiths. So these are issues of concern, that there is a segment that ascribes to Sharia law, that ascribes to the religion, the tenets of the law, and they do it, and they take it at its word. This is the main concern that we're facing. So when one calls out these concerns, and even the news of the Muslim rape gangs, let's say in the UK, one is not being Islamophobic to express concern, but at the same time, you've got these lobbies that are telling you to question Islam. You are being Islamophobic. That is very wrong. And in Canada, under Islamophobia Motion M103, we've got groups like the NCCM that are arbiters over M103 and charging that Canadians are fearful and hateful of the religion Islam, which is simply not the case because they have a different faith. Canadians aren't doing this, or anybody else for that matter, aren't questioning issues of people who are of the Hindu background, of the Buddhist background, unless, of course, there's some drive to take over, but there is not that type of impulse and those other faiths. So there is a definite reason for it, and Islamophobia should not even be a word used. I've said it before. It comes down from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to shut down criticism of Islam. Yes, it incorporates discrimination against faith believers in Islam, which is wrong, but it also incorporates criticism of Islam, which we should not have in any Western country. Now, it's interesting that Thomas Jefferson, who had a quarrelsome relationship with the press, once said that, quote, "Our liberty depends on the freedom of the press." And that should be common sense, folks, because there is no such thing as a totalitarian regime that honors freedom of the press and freedom of thought and expression, and they're like that for a reason. Now, the next item that we're going to discuss, Ezra Levant and Rebel Media are back with us in our briefing. This time, it centers around a problem with Canada's infamous jihadist, Omar Khadr. And I want to give you a little bit of background about Omar Khadr, because many of you in America don't really know the story about this guy. We sometimes assume in Canada that this is a big deal and Americans know about it, but it's not always the case. So let me give you a bit of background about Omar Khadr for those of you who may not know. You likely heard of his name, but you may not know the full story. Now, Omar Khadr was born in Canada to an infamous Al-Qaeda family. I'll tell you about the family shortly, but Omar was captured in 2002 as a 15-year-old young jihadist and later pleaded guilty to 5 war crimes. Now, he was 15 years old. People talk about, oh, this little kid. He was 15 years old, okay? He was then moved to a Canadian prison when he came back from Guantanamo. Now he's recanted his confession, and currently he's appealing the US conviction. So Khadr is continuing to fight that conviction. In November, as early as that, just some months ago, a US military court was still refusing to hear Omar Khadr's challenge of his convictions and of his confessions from his days in Guantanamo Bay. I'm thankful for that, and I hope that it continues. As a teen in Guantanamo, he was roughed up a little after being sent back home. And after being sent back home to Canada, he was determined to let the public know so much about him being roughed up, and apparently it was a little too much. So despite his horrific action and confessions to them, what happened was that, okay, let me give you a background on what this guy did before I go on any further. Among Khadr's confessed crimes, he killed an American Special Forces medic, Christopher Speer, and blinded Wayne Morris. So because he was roughed up, his rights were deemed in Canada to be violated as a Canadian citizen. So Khadr ended up with Justin Trudeau deciding to issue a government apology to him and defending a $10.5 million payout to Omar Khadr of taxpayer money. The widow of Speer, Tabitha, and the blinded soldier had been and still are trying to get compensation for their ordeal. More to remember is that Khadr's lawyer was out for big bucks. $20 million in compensation to Khadr is what he was out for, and seeking a formal apology, which he got, except it was $10.5 million instead. The victims never saw any compensation from Khadr. The Globe and Mail reported in 2017 that Canadians know this is wrong, while Canadian opposition leader Andrew Scheer said on Twitter, if Omar Khadr was really sorry for what he did, he'll give every cent to Tabitha Speer and her 2 children, unquote. Now recently, according to the Post-Millennial in Canada, we covered it on Jihad Watch as well, they said, Omar Khadr, the infamous, well-paid convicted terrorist and real-life supervillain, will be featured, get this, as a keynote speaker at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The topic, children's rights, where Omar Khadr gets to play the victim, and he gets presented as an innocent victim at that, a respectable Canadian citizen. And let's face it, it helps his case now to recant, in recanting his confessions, and it helps to fight his previous convictions, because it makes him look like he's some respectable victim. Shame on Dalhousie University. It sets a very dangerous and a damaging precedent. So I'll go over with you now some info about Omar Khadr's family before we show you a video that depicts how Ezra ended up with this encounter with Khadr at the airport. But I want to show you, I want to give you a little bit of background on the family to show you that it's no wonder that Omar Khadr did what he did as an Al-Qaeda terrorist. So beginning with Dad, Ahmed Saeed Khadr, born in Egypt, moved to Canada in 1977, where he met his wife and got married. He was among the Mujahideen who fought the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s, where American authorities say he befriended Osama bin Laden and became a founding member and financier of Al-Qaeda. He was then arrested in connection with the bombing of the Egyptian embassy in Islamabad in 1995. But get this, he was released in 1996 with the help of then Liberal Prime Minister Jacques Chrétien. Ahmed Saeed Khadr eventually, after the help from Jacques Chrétien, went back to his jihadist activities, and he died eventually in a gun battle with Pakistan forces near Afghanistan border in 2003, 7 years after the Prime Minister Chrétien intervened on his behalf. So here's a little bit about the rest of the Khadr kids, going in order of ages, which are pretty close. They're all in their 30s. One may be around 40 now, but they're all pretty much in their 30s. Zainab Khadr, that's the firstborn, and that's the sister of Omar Khadr, the oldest. Bin Laden is said to have attended her wedding. She returned to live in Canada in 2005, became the subject of an RCMP investigation into her aiding of Al-Qaeda. She married 4 times. Her third husband, Canadian Joshua Boyle, was kidnapped near Kabul in 2012. So that's her third ex-husband. Last word, Zainab was in custody in Turkey. Now, let's deviate for a moment. Joshua Boyle ended up living in Canada with his new family in 2018. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, as he came to Canada in 2018, ended up in a friendly, secret meeting with Joshua Boyle. The meeting was left out of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's usual daily itinerary. No one knows why Trudeau accepted the meeting, nor was it ever discussed. Canadians only know that Boyle, he faces 15 charges, including 8 counts of assault, 2 counts of unlawful confinement, and 1 count of misleading the police for alleged crimes that occurred almost immediately upon his return to Canada in October 2018. Next, Omar Khadr's older brother, Abdullah Khadr, he denied running an al-Qaeda training camp in Afghanistan in the 1990s. He returned to Canada in 2005 after spending a year in custody in Pakistan where he was tortured. He was arrested almost immediately in Canada, and he was accused of buying arms and ammunition for al-Qaeda militants in Afghanistan. Federal court freed him a bit over 4 years later on the grounds that US authorities had abused his rights in Pakistan. He now lives in Toronto. So do you see that common thread? Al-Qaeda people being constantly seen as victims of abuse. Get that. Next brother, Abdurrahman. He's the only one that's said to have left the Al-Qaeda life. In fact, he calls himself the black sheep of the family and says he was raised, quote, to be a suicide bomber, unquote. Next is Omar Khadr, who we'll return to. But going on to the youngest, Abdullah Karim. He was wounded in the same Al-Qaeda gun battle that killed his dad near Afghanistan, and he continues to live in Canada, paralyzed from the waist down, reportedly getting free medical for years now in Canada's medical, in Canadian taxpayers in the medical system. So, Ezra Levant decided to cover this preposterous event on children's rights to boot. Never mind what Tabitha Spears' children went through when their dad was murdered by the likes of Omar Khadr. So now that you have some background on the whole family, we're going to go back to Omar because you're going to see this video soon. So we're going to show you Ezra Levant's encounter at the airport with Omar Khadr. And I'm going to call on Mary with Sharia Crime Stoppers to come back in now because I hope that she has that video ready to show you what happened at the airport when Ezra Levant decided to say, look, I got to cover this at Dalhousie. So he happened to accidentally run into this guy. So take a look at that report.
Yes, ma'am. Here it is.
Thank you, Mary.
Can I have a word? Can I talk to you for a minute?
Can we take a selfie together?
If you want.
Yeah?
Can I ask you a couple questions? How did you get on the plane? I thought you were on the no-fly list.
So this is exactly what we figured would happen. Why don't we go ahead and walk away from toxic things that are hurtful?
Why don't you? But how? But aren't you on the no-fly list?
Is there security?
For me or for him?
Yeah, for filming a person when that's really not an okay thing to do. So please.
Trying to move.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, why you won't let the widow have access to some of the money you got?
Excuse me, officer, he's harassing us.
I'm not harassing anybody. That's a convicted Al-Qaeda terrorist right there who just flew on an airplane.
Okay, sir. Well, he's entitled.
He's entitled to do what?
He's entitled to leave the airport.
Yeah.
That's good. Thanks.
Excuse me, sir.
Why it's assault. Get your hands off me. Why have you never renounced your father's terrorism?
I don't understand.
Why have you
this is
never
allowed,
renounced
but
your
it's not.
father's terrorism?
Okay, just walk. We need to go.
Because we're not under Sharia law.
Let's just walk to the car. Come on.
Where have you stashed the rest of the money? Why don't you feel an obligation to pay money to the widow whose husband you murdered and the 2 children?
This is an airport. There's a public place.
Exactly, that's why I'm filming.
We're just trying to move. And your proximity.
She's touching me, that's battery.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is actually.
My hands are open.
That's a terrorist. That's an Al-Qaeda terrorist right there. Al-Qaeda terrorist. It's an Al-Qaeda terrorist right there.
Okay.
Al-Qaeda terrorist right there.
Okay. Go ahead. Just go on. Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Sir?
Yeah.
Sir?
Yes. Yes. Why are you touching me?
You're impeding someone from leaving the building.
No, I'm not. You're impeding me from leaving the building. What's your name and badge
I'll give you my
number?
card, sir. Okay?
Give it to me.
I will give it to you, sir. close to being arrested. You understand me?
And you're very close to getting a civil lawsuit for assault and battery.
Don't jaywalk, sir. Crosswalk's back there, okay? Am I clear? Don't jaywalk.
What are you stepping on me for?
Doing your job, sir. Doing your job.
And what job is that?
Keeping the public safe.
Whose safety was in breach there?
Everyone's safety, sir.
You're a goddamn liar, and you know it. You're a disgrace to that badge, and you're a disgrace.
I'm proud of what I do, sir.
You're proud of defending a terrorist?
I'm proud of keeping people safe, sir.
Safe from whom? Convicted Al-Qaeda terrorist Omar Khadr is flying around on Air Canada jets. The pilots didn't even know, and the police threatened to arrest me if I kept talking about it. Visit jailkhadr.com to help me fight back.
It's all yours now.
And thank you, Mary. And with that, Omar Khadr is trying to recant his confession coming from an Al-Qaeda family. In fact, at one time when he was in Guantanamo, there's another fellow way back that was roughed up also in Syria, Arar. He was given $10 million by the government of the day too. But the point of the matter is, Khadr, when he was in Guantanamo, identified Arar and said that he saw him fighting on the front lines, which, and I don't want to talk about Arar tonight, but the point is, Khadr, he was out there. He was on the front lines with his family. It's how that family was raised. He had a confession, and his confession, by the way, was 10 years after, making him 25 years old. They're trying to make him out now to be a victim, that he was forced into a confession. Come on. Now, a couple things I'd like you to point out, in fact, about the video you just saw. I'm going to back up here because I wrote an article for Jihad Watch, and it was republished in Front Page Magazine with a couple changes here and there that I wanted to add some background with. But I was written by someone who felt that that Ezra pushed the wrong buttons, that he was sort of a disturber. That thinking is wrong. I'll tell you why I say so. If you notice, immediately when Ezra approaches and says, "Can I have a word with you?" he was very quiet about it. He was met with a smug sarcasm and smirk. And Omar Khadr replied, "Do you want to take a selfie together?" How offensive can you be, considering your history? Ezra quietly asks valid questions. Why haven't you given any money to victims? And why have you not renounced your father's terrorism? Very valid questions. Nothing. Ezra only gets louder when the police intervene, unnecessarily, obnoxiously. Now, had everybody just kept walking and ignored Ezra, he would have gotten the same questions in. People would have seen, but it wouldn't have been the way it was. The police defended the indefensible. They didn't have to get involved, and not every cop would have handled it that way. In fact, Ezra's rights, as he indicated, were violated. He was not under arrest. He was not about to be detained. Nobody had any right to put their hands on him. Nobody had any right to step on his foot. This was a violation, and what it does is that it reminds me of history. And I'm not saying anything here that anybody doesn't know, but what has happened in history, people say history is doomed to repeat itself because human beings don't learn. The Gestapo didn't just happen overnight. It happened in stages. When we are in a system where a government is starting to get corrupt and look out for the wrong people, namely the socialist element and the Islamist element, we have a problem on our hands. And the police should be looking out for the public to keep the peace. If they had merely followed from a distance and said, just keep walking, everybody, Khadr would have been out, Ezra would have been out, no problem. Instead, they were up in Ezra Levant's face, defending the indefensible. That should scare people. Another related item, Mustafa Farouk, the executive director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, formerly CARECAN, an offshoot, as I mentioned, of the unindicted co-conspirator to Jihad Terror CARE, he tweeted out after the incident with Ezra, Omar Khadr, get this, is a national hero who did nothing wrong. Ezra Levant, on the other hand, poses an actual public safety threat by instigating racist hatred and violence against minorities. Wow, this is shocking, but you see, That's the problem. Every day, we keep getting bombarded with shocking news to the point where most people have just given up, not realizing that they're losing their rights and freedoms. When we see this kind of audacity coming out, there is reason for serious concern. And people need to get involved with what's happening to their rights and freedoms. Calling a man like Omar Khadr from a family like that, who confessed to what he did and confessed to being guilty of murder. He did nothing wrong and he's a national hero? Wow. And minorities, accusing Ezra of instigating racial hatred and violence against minorities. Wow, that is really flabbergasting. Okay, so our next topic now, and I hope you ponder that one well because it affects all of us here. Now, the next one, I've got a couple of graphics that I think Dick has ready to show up on the screen because this one is also offensive. Trudeau meeting with the Iranian foreign minister less than a month after Iran shot down the Ukraine passenger jet. And after Trudeau was featured in photo ops where he was looking all concerned and sad along with the victims' families, and he even went so far as to blame escalating tensions for the crash, which, well, he said it was escalating tension, so that was his way of pointing out Trump for those escalating tensions. So 57 Canadians were among the 176 killed, and Trudeau's meeting with Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, happened at the Munich Security Conference last Friday. But you look at him, I mean, if you go on YouTube, you'll find videos on it. The guy's sycophantic. He is practically worshiping the Iranian foreign minister, and it's not just a brief handshake and a nod. It's almost like a nodding bow where he doesn't just shake his hand, he practically embraces the guy. I mean, what is going on? Now, he tried to come up with a defense saying that he made a promise to families in Canada to do everything he could to make sure that they got answers. He says, I wanted to impress upon the foreign minister of Iran how important it is that we work together. And the only reason he did it again is because, and I applaud the Canadian media for that. The mainstream media was depicting what happened. They're the ones that came out, and they even showed videos as well, showing what this man was doing, the way he was embracing Iran's foreign minister. And they showed the pictures of what he did when he was there sympathizing with the victims' families. Now, what's he talking about? Work together with Iran? And he thinks that sucking up to the Iranian jihadists is going to work? Wow. A reminder of what else this guy's up to in the Middle East. In early December, Trudeau broke with Canada's tradition by betraying Israel following a vote on a pro-Palestinian UN resolution. Canada backed a final vote on a resolution condemning Israel as, quote, an occupying power, despite recent assurances to the Jewish community. The resolution also accused Israel of impeding the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Time to start connecting more dots. Trudeau has been lobbying hard for Canada to win a temporary seat on the United Nations Security Council. He was also in Africa last week, making his pitch everywhere. So that's the news I'd like to bring to you for analysis and for you to absorb what is taking place in the northern border. It's something to be very wary of and very concerned about given the direction. Now, something else needs to be mentioned, and I didn't plan on mentioning this today, but I'm going to. At the 44th session of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation's meeting of foreign ministers of their OIC, Canada went. And the question was being asked, what exactly is Canada doing attending a 44th conference of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation? We're not an Islamic nation, but Omar al-Ghabra was the one, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding him as well, attended on Canada's behalf with a contingent. Okay, so now moving on to other news in Canada. There's a report that came out for concern, and just for us to, again, try to keep on top of what is going on in the country. Now, this came out of the Gulf News that Islamic finance, the Gulf News said, is soaring in Canada because Canada is home, the news report says, to 1.5 million Muslims, or around 4% of the population, which makes Muslims the second largest religion in the country and also the fastest growing. And most are immigrants. And expect a demand for Sharia finance to increase and continue to as Canada goes along, because Canada continues to welcome projected 1 million immigrants a year, with a prime minister that has also, yes, he has done this, declared evangelicals the worst part of Canadian society. Look it up in the Christian Post. Plus, Canada's zeal to lead the charge on the UN Migration Pact will spell radical change for Canada, the report says, turning migration into a human right. That's sobering given Trudeau's dismal record on promoting the interests of Islamic supremacists. There are plenty of opportunities for Islamic banking in Canada, the Gulf report goes on to say, because it says that based on projections of this substantial increase in the population, with a growing interest of foreign investors noticing that Canada is developing into a Western hub for Islamic investment and finance, quote, following in the footsteps of the UK. But allowing Sharia compliant financing is not all it's cracked up to be. In fact, it's quite dangerous. According to Frank Gaffney, who's the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy, Gaffney warns that it is, he did this years ago, it is green light, that Sharia finance is green lighting a seditious system that supports jihad. He further states, and I'm quoting him here, if you understand what Sharia is, you'll understand that it's a pretty awful system. Not something you'd want insinuated on your society and becoming a major feature of your economic system. Sharia, and that's Islamic law as dictated in the Quran, governs all aspects of life, he goes on to say, from the personal practice of the faith to how you relate to your family and how you relate to your business partners, to your community. You can't just take it and say, I'll take the personal practice and skip the beheading and the flogging and the stoning and the global theocracy, unquote. Valid warning. The Canadian banking sector, too, is reportedly has about $18 billion worth of Sharia-compliant mortgages, and Sharia financing is rapidly expanding into the insurance sector as well. Now, moving along to other news that's important to Canada and everybody in the West, you may be or may not be aware of the Georgetown University Bridge Initiative. Okay, I'll start with that headline of what I'm going to discuss here. The Bridge Initiative wants to re-litigate the trial of the Hamas-linked charity, the Holy Land Foundation. This bears huge impact, particularly in North America. Now, some background now about that Bridge Initiative. It's the project of the Alaouid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. That's the name of it. It's known for its fact sheets, which mixes in profuse lies. Many who fight against the jihad are filled in with those fact sheets, including myself. Now the Georgetown University Bridge Initiative has published a fact sheet in defense of the convicted Hamas fundraising organization known as the Holy Land Foundation. It distorts basic facts about the Holy Land Foundation case, in which the nation's largest Islamic charity, and I'm talking in America when I say the nation's this time, because I know that I switch back and forth sometimes from Canada to the US. So this was the nation's, the US's largest Islamic charity, and 5 of its employees were convicted on 104 felony charges, including providing material support for the terrorist organization Hamas. In fact, the Holy Land Foundation trial is known as the largest terrorism in history of financing terrorism in the United States. Now, according to the website Discover the Networks, a reliable website, court documents show that the Holy Land Foundation was created by a network called the Palestine Committee, which is now defunct. But it was established by the Muslim Brotherhood to advance Hamas's political and financial agendas in the United States. The Holy Land Foundation trial accurately identified threatening unindicted co-conspirators, which I'm sure most of you are aware of that term now, to jihad terror and their links to Hamas. So to challenge that is significant, you see, because this Holy Land Foundation trial was perhaps the biggest stumbling block there was to block stealth jihadists everywhere, as it identifies the who's who of the Muslim Brotherhood networks. So the Holy Land Foundation precursor is the Occupied Land Fund, was named in May 1991 the Muslim Brotherhood document titled, and I know most of you are familiar with this, an explanatory memorandum on the general strategic goal for the group in North America, as one of the Muslim Brotherhood's 29 like-minded organizations of our friends that shared the common goal of destroying America and turning it into a Muslim nation. This isn't something that people were making up here. This was presented as fact in a trial. These friends were identified by the Muslim Brotherhood groups that could help teach Muslims, quote, that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands so that God's religion, Islam, is made victorious over all other religions, unquote. At Georgetown University and many others, money talks. In 2005, the controversial Georgetown Center on Muslim Christian Understanding was renamed Al-Aweed bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding in recognition of a $20 million gift from Saudi Prince Al-Walid bin Talal bin Abdul Aziz Al Saud. But not everyone is easily bought. New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani returned a $10 million check from Al-Walid bin Talal because he contributed that after 9/11. The reason the check was returned was, although it denounced the attack, you see, this is a kind of a ploy that's used. You'll hear Muslim Brotherhood organizations criticizing the 9/11 attack, basically the violent wing of jihad. But you see, there's a tandem thing going on here. They do it because it looks good. But the bottom line is, when you look at their connections to Hamas and you look at what their general plan is for North America, the Muslim Brotherhood plan, you realize that it's the same plan, but just a different way of working that plan. In fact, the Muslim Brotherhood movement was often called a reformist movement because their methodology was more sophisticated, more looked like the West. It was based on charities, and it was based on a kind of a sophisticated system that you see in democracies. So anyway, going back to Rudy Giuliani, when he returned that check, this is what was discussed about that $10 million. It implied that U.S. policy, even though it condemned 9/11, it implied that U.S. policy had caused 9/11. He explicitly called the prince on the United States to, quote, re-examine its policies in the Middle East and adopt a more balanced stance toward the Palestinian cause, and claimed that the charge that our Palestinian brother continued to be slaughtered at the hands of Israelis while the world turns the other cheek, unquote. So that check was returned. Kudos to Giuliani, who couldn't be bought. Unfortunately, Georgetown is another story. Bottom line, Islamic supremacists and stealth jihadists have been buying people and institutions in democracies. The Bridge Initiative is not a center for Muslim Christian understanding at all. It's a center of propaganda aimed at subverting American and Canadian democracy. The Bridge Initiative also operates in Canada at Wilfrid Laurier University, and I'm unfortunately on that list as well. Now, the next item on the list, and this is an item concerning one young 28-year-old Vanessa Levine, and it really highlights some of the plight that we see happening to Jewish students on campuses. This 28-year-old newly minted Jewish Harvard Club member, Vanessa Levine, says a Muslim Harvard professor, Faris Musa Sa, called her a whore, grabbed her by her arm, and bruised it as he tried to take away the mic during a pro-Palestinian lecture at the venue. The club is a 154-year-old club. So Vanessa Levine was the one that ended up getting booted out of the club, period. Well, she's now suing. Good for her. Levine states that she peaceably asked during a question and answer period how Middle East peace could be achieved if Palestinians are taught to support terrorism against Jews and Israelis. A fair question. The audience then erupted in mob-like fury at her query, according to her lawsuit. Furthermore, Vanessa and her mom were asked by security to leave that club. Angry audience members followed them out of the hall, photographed her, and chanted, "We're going to get you expelled," while she was thrown out of the club, and I applaud her in bringing forth that lawsuit. Let's wish her the best on that one. Our next item here, Hungary joins the US's new Religious Freedom Alliance, declares liberalism to be over. I'm a huge fan of Hungarian leader Viktor Orban. He's yet again repeated that he's not going to accept Muslim migration into Hungary. Hungary has, and many of you may not know this, a Christian constitution, and it does not intend to welcome any policies that may threaten that. Now, when I visited Hungary in November for its second international conference on Christian persecution, Orban spoke at that conference, and he indicated that Hungary has suffered under the forces of communism and under the Ottoman Empire, and that it intends to keep its country free of potential damage. A quote from Orban during his speech: "This is why the Hungarian constitution states, we recognize the role of Christianity in preserving nationhood. So the Hungarian people and the Hungarian government believe that Christianity can help peoples and nations to survive as it has helped us." Hungary has provided, by the way, $50 million of aid to communities in Africa and Middle East. In case anybody noticed, these communities are visible minorities. So he gets called racist and Islamophobic, which he is not. And this man is reaching out to the persecuted Christians. Now, Orban has now joined the US Religious Freedom Alliance. And there's one thing I want to add while I was there that was of interest to me, because I was invited over to the Migration Research Institute in Hungary, where I met with some brilliant researchers there, including one that seemed quite leftist. In fact, he was. But I asked them the question, what happens if Orban is ever not elected? Where are you guys going to go? Because he has been firm in supporting the Constitution of Hungary and protecting its Christian constitution. The people that I interviewed said, unwavering, that is the way of the Hungarian people. Not all of them are religious, and when they say Christian, they don't necessarily mean going to church every Sunday. In fact, what he was saying, what one of the researchers was saying, is that perhaps most don't go to church, but they support the Christian constitution because they realize it is there to recognize human rights and freedoms, and this is something that Hungarians support. So while Viktor Orban is one that has stood up to the EU, and he is the one that has really stood up to the EU, because they were persecuting him and the Polish leader at the time, I'm trying to remember her name now, but that was the former Polish leader, Beata Szydło, actually, that was her name, because they will not accept migrant quotas. He really stood up and he refused to back down. So I really admire him there. He's part of what's called the Visegrad group in Eastern Europe that consists of Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, and they have been stern on protecting the democracy of their nations. So going back to this Religious Freedoms Alliance, he's joined it. That's the first European Union member to actually join that alliance, and it was launched by President Trump quite recently. The alliance is a network of like-minded countries fully committed to advancing the freedom of religion or belief around the world. By the way, I was proud to be, under the Harper government, an advisor in the Office of Religious Freedoms, but Trudeau shut down the Office of Religious Freedoms in Canada. So anyway, its inaugural meeting, this alliance, was on the 5th of February in Washington, D.C. Hungary's foreign minister noted that Christianophobia, he called it, is the last acceptable form of discrimination in the world. And he added, in fact, before I go on to what he added, I'm going to add this: so is discrimination against the state of Israel. So we need to think about that one. People try to separate the two. The Jewish state of Israel is under persecution, make no mistake about it. Since its birth in 1948, efforts have been out by the Palestinian Authority. The PLO was created with a mandate to obliterate the state of Israel. In fact, it states in the PLO charter, the mandate is to liquidate Israel. The PLO, the Fatah charters, the Hamas charters, they all indicate the obliteration of Israel as a goal. So if you want to talk peace, how about we begin by eliminating those goals within those charters? So anyway, let me move on here with the Hungarian foreign minister. He also noted that more, and I couldn't agree more needs to be done to protect the members of religious minority groups and combat discrimination and persecution based on religion. And he does not accept that international organizations have turned what he calls a blind eye to the persecution of Christian minorities around the world. There is a genocide going on in Africa, and that is under the international word of genocide, which is accepted. This is a genocide happening in Africa and in parts of the Middle East. Christians are suffering, and somehow it's being ignored. Religious freedom simply does not exist in normative Islam. So mass migration, political correctness, we can see, the stifling of free speech, multiculturalism, and what I mean by multiculturalism in this context, I'm not talking many cultures, I'm talking declaring all cultures equal. Anti-Christian and anti-Israel and Jewish sentiment and tolerance for Islamization have now become the hallmarks of contemporary liberalism, which is really too bad, because that is not what classic liberalism was based on. So Orban has declared as a result that liberalism is over. Every country, every free country should have the right to defend its borders and should protect its freedom of speech. Now, Our last item here, in fact, our second to last item here concerns, and I'm going to try to go through this quickly because I want to get to the Q&A and also bring back in our friends Dick and Mary to have a bit of a discussion with me here. There's a revelation that came out of a CBN interview that Soleimani was planning to take American hostages in the Iraq embassy and broker a sanctions relief. Now, Michael Pregent, his name is, from the Hudson Institute, and he's a well-known Middle East intelligence expert who's fought in that region. He said that killing Qasem Soleimani was actually a de-escalating event, not an escalating one, a de-escalating one. He revealed in the interview that they were going to take over the embassy, take all the Americans in the embassy hostage, and broker their release in exchange for sanctions release. This shouldn't surprise anybody given the history of Iran. And it's quite plausible, in fact, because if you look at their history of aggression, and this is another important fact that we need to take into consideration, that many officials of the Iran-backed Popular Mobilization Forces were also present and were killed in the American strike along with Soleimani, including the deputy commander of the Popular Mobilization Force. That's very significant. Also, to back up Pregent's statements, Rocky Sickman was a man that was one of the 52 Americans taken hostage when the US embassy in Tehran in 1979 was taken over and held captive for 444 days. He said that the killing of Soleimani, he said, has been a long time in the coming, and that they knew he was not coming in for a Tupperware party. He was coming in to make a major plan to kill additional Americans, unquote. As former US ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley put it, the only ones that are mourning the loss of Soleimani are the Democratic leadership and the Democrat presidential candidates, unquote. Well, we have the same type over here in Canada as well. Now, to go along with on that same theme of Soleimani, the Iranian regime is now using his daughter, Soleimani's daughter Zainab, to persuade terrorist organizations, both Sunni and Shia, to carry out attacks against the United States. And Zainab, named after Muhammad's only granddaughter, she's a full participant. There's a 1-minute video online that shows her dressed in black with a weapon at her side, declaring in a combat speech in Arabic. And this was the interpretation of the speech. In the name of Almighty Allah, she says, I address you, my fathers, faithful, not only in Iran, but in the Islamic world. I confess in my name and my family to all those on the front lines of the resistance that will not be silent until the death of my father is avenged. My father who defended you and all those who have been wronged with his own blood, unquote. She then turns to the United States and Israel, talking about them, and says, as for the great Satan of the United States and Israel, you will know that my father left behind 1,000 Qasem Soleimanis because you have made him victorious, and his blood will lead us to the road to pray in Jerusalem, unquote. Zainab has already been seen in Lebanon, where she met with Hezbollah leader Nasrallah and asked him, because of his longtime friendship with her father, to avenge Soleimani's death. So this is the end of my briefing for today, and in 2 weeks I'll be back to do it, but I'm going to ask Mary and Dick to rejoin me, because Mary will be also managing any questions that may come in, and they always have interesting items to point out. Mary, there you are.
I'm here. Well done, well done. So much to cover. I've got many questions myself. Dick, go ahead. I know you usually kick it off.
Well, thank you so much, Christine. And again, make America think again. This is a firestorm of objects to make us think again. So here's my thoughts in my notes, and let's bounce them back to the top, because there's so much. If I'm not mistaken, France is 4% Muslim, and all hell has broken out in France. Most people know that. It's a country that has, almost somebody mentioned, it should have its own two-state solution. It's so enclaved up, it's very difficult for the police to do their job, etc. The political leaders are totally confused. You said Canada had 4%. Most Americans don't know that. 4% is a big number. Again, the population in Canada is not, it's not as large as America, of course, but 4% is a significant indicator of the aggressiveness of the Muslim community and the cowardice of the non-Muslim community to in any way critique them or stop them or hold them back.
Yes, according to the Gulf News, that is the case. And there's a point I'd like to mention, Dick, concerning France. And we know that the so-called populists are called every name in the book when they simply support democracy. I mean, you look at certain populist leaders, like I mentioned, the Hungarian leader that's called racist and Islamophobe, and he's putting tens of millions into helping the visible minority persecuted Christians. Well, they're not minorities there, but what we call visible minorities here in Syria and in Iraq. So the problem that we see in France in fact, the good part to deal with the problems that we see is that the populists are the ones that are stirring the population. And the leader in France, Macron, he's nervous. He has been flip-flopping all over the place. And I've written quite a bit on Jihad Watch about him and watched his flip-flopping back and forth. He has been coming down quite hard on certain mosques in France, which seems to be unlike him, out of character. There's also a girl in France, 16 years old, and I covered that last week, that said things about Islam. She said she hates the religion. That's what she said. And she said some things about it that disturbed her. And as a result, she was forced into hiding. Eventually, it turned out she had to switch schools because if she had stayed in the same school, well, basically the police told her, stay at home. So she was under almost a house arrest. Nobody was arrested, by the way, and you wonder why. Because how could they, with all these, this deploying of police and other personnel to monitor online hate, how come nobody's caught anybody who's threatened this young girl? So her life has changed. And lo and behold, Macron comes around and says he agrees with her. Her rights to free speech should not be challenged. So what we see happening in France is a bit of a turn going on here, because Macron is threatened. He is seeing that the population is starting to say, what's going on here? Wait a minute. And they're turning more toward, some of them, the populist leaders, which is making him nervous. So we are seeing some turns in France, and I'm hoping that that ignites and that it continues. I don't have much hope for Macron, but I'm hoping that the population will change enough that we could see a different leadership there, or at least some kind of a balance to shift France back to for some sense, to have some sense, to at least realize, wait a minute here, they're not living under Sharia, they're living in a democracy. Canada, the same. We should not be under M103. It is a violation of democratic rights and freedoms, a violation of the Constitution. And Sharia finance, like you said, it's a grave concern. Money talks.
Those are very, very helpful. So just in continuing in some order of what you covered, you talked about the money that comes out of the taxpayers into the government under Trudeau, and he provides that money for his things. For example, $23 million was part of the whole related to the M103, and $600 million committed to media that follows according to his lead. These are really troublesome. I think the laws of the resolution also included aggressive training for law enforcement to enforce hate. The interesting thing is, in America, we cannot get any law enforcement to take training about what Sharia is, yet the laws, apparently the laws of the government of Canada can impose training requirements on police to make sure that hate speech doesn't happen. I think that's really, really interesting. The other thing is the article that relates to your topic talked about a soft totalitarianism coming to Canada. And I think you're giving examples of that.
Yes. And to what you were saying about this $23 million document, it specifically says that the government of Canada recognizes that the effectiveness of these hate speech laws requires law enforcement agencies to have training, preparedness, and capacity to report and investigate hate crimes, both offline and in the cyber domain. And of course, to crack down on Islamophobia and monitor citizens for compliance. Now, there were those that said, oh, M103 is not law. But if you look at it, it doesn't have to be law to implement its practice. It's a motion that was passed in Parliament that forms the basis for future laws. And in addition to that, it gave rise to this document that was titled Taking Action Against Systemic Racism and Religious Discrimination, which includes Islamophobia. So this is what Canadians are paying into, and the money goes on to pay groups like the NCCM and IRFAN, who Iqra Khalid announced on you can see it on YouTube, announced in one of her when she was standing up addressing a group, she announced that these two groups will be part of the consultants helping along the implementation of M103 in this $23 million plan.
When you say IRFAN, you're talking about the CARE Canada, and explain what IRFAN
Islamic
is.
Relief. IRFAN is,
Okay.
Islamic Relief Canada. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
And that was
For
deemed
our
to be
attendees.
connected to terrorism and designated under terrorism under the former Harper government. And of course, that restricted its funding. But right now, they're being brought right back in by the Trudeau government to implement action against Canadians. And this plan that they had, that LifeSite News talks about, this absurd plan that got the attention of the mainstream media, when you look at it and you connect the dots, this goes right along with that plan.
So, by the way, one of the reasons that we're so grateful for Christine is that she's giving us things to think about that are in detail, that are factual. They happen to handle some of them above the border, but we want you to think again, make America think again about things that you've heard about that are happening in America. So, for example, across the border from Canada is Michigan. Michigan has a governor. She was selected, Governor Whitmer was selected by the Democratic Party to give their rebuttal to the State of the Union. Governor Whitmer has a hate crimes division actively working every single day with taxpayer money in Michigan to identify, keep databases on the haters in Michigan, which are, they have adopted the Southern Poverty Law Center as the definers of hate. You are looking at two people who are on the hate list in America, with the governor of Michigan speaking for the Democratic Party. That's just a comment. The other comment I think was devastating that you said, and these things are really, really good, Christine. Trudeau said the worst of the society are the evangelicals.
Yeah.
Hello, if that was the position of the governor of Michigan or the candidate for president from Vermont, if Bernie happened to be thinking in the same policy mentality of Justin Trudeau, that's a terrifying message for evangelicals in America. So we speak to evangelicals, invite them to register and vote. And if in fact they fail and Bernie's the president, I wonder if Bernie might just say that evangelicals are the very worst part of America and they need to be monitored and tracked and marginalized. So that's just, I thought that was important.
For those of you who like horror stories, look up on the internet Bernie Sanders and Project Veritas, because they revealed some really scary stuff about this Bernie Sanders. It's unbelievable. I mean, they were even against Trump for cracking down on Soleimani, for not cracking down, for killing him, which was a necessity given what he was doing and given his what he had planned for the future. And that's something I'll likely address next, because you've got this Democratic campaign that is against everything that a democracy should stand for. And there's a pattern going on here, and we're seeing it in Europe, that they're calling so-called populists and people who really care about free speech and democracy, they're calling them undemocratic. Go figure. They don't want to defend this barrage of unvetted, this massive migrants coming into their countries. So they're saying they're undemocratic. The words that they're using, you see, what they're using now is catchphrases, because they know that people are busy and they use these lies and these propagandist words and they just put them together without any common sense at all. They just throw it out there and people are buying into it. And they realize, wait a minute here, we're getting somewhere with this. So they just keep on doing it and they're not getting challenged. Again, Make America Think Again is a great name for a program too.
Well, if you listen to the Democrats speak, you will hear them speak about the patriotism that they are effecting, that they are truly standing for America and the Constitution, when they are doing exactly the opposite. They have not got one clue what the Constitution is all about in terms of freedoms that this country has been given, because all they want to do is take it away and make government run every part of your life. So they are not being patriots, but that's the words they're using. So people hear that, like you said, just short memory spans, so that all they hear is, oh, I'm a patriot. I believe in the Constitution. And this is Elizabeth Warren. This is everyone from Hillary Clinton, who may be a vice presidential candidate now. And it's incredible what these people are trying to convince people that they stand for.
And Nancy Pelosi is invoking prayer. She's constantly talking about prayer and praying for Donald Trump, this woman,
Yeah.
and people believe her.
And she was thrown out
Maybe
of the Catholic
she believes
Church.
her.
She was thrown out of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
But yet she's a Catholic. Okay.
So's the Pope.
Yeah. And that's a whole nother story.
Oh, yes, it is.
Well,
Okay.
you know, Christine, I knew you were fired from that department in Canada, the Religious Freedoms Department, but I didn't know he shut them down.
Actually, I was fired, and I'm gonna do a shameless plug here.
Please do.
This is my book, Fired by the Government of Canada for Criticizing Islam. Multicultural Canada, a weak link in the battle against Islamization. And this was published by the Center for Security Policy. And I'm proud to say it was a bestseller. My other book actually was about the challenge of modernizing Islam. And so I was fired from the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which was a Privy Council appointment. Now, the Religious Freedoms Office was, it was different. It was shut down. The whole office was shut down. But the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, I was removed by the Privy Council on the recommendation of the Heritage Minister at the time, who was eventually demoted for something else or another, Melanie Joly. So there's a new Heritage Minister now. But it's interesting because I used to write extensively about M103, and that was one of the points listed in Melanie Joly's letter to me about some of my writings. So I was fighting for writing for Jihad Watch and pointing out the warnings of Islamization and the warnings about what Islamic supremacism is doing to societies, doing to individuals, particularly women. And that is the reason I got fired. And it's all outlined in this book, the whole story about it, including the letter that Melanie Joly wrote to me, the registered letter she sent, and the one I sent back to her, where I was advised by some, in addition to what I wrote, I passed it by some influential folks that said, wow, I mean, they couldn't believe. This was just ridiculous. There was being hired by the Privy Council as they call it term of pleasure. It does mean the government could fire you without cause. It means that, but they gave me cause. They sent that letter and gave me cause, and it was because of my writings on Islam. This was not something I assumed. I knew it was going on, but I got a letter proving it. So this is what's going on in Canada, and I was writing extensively about M103, which came out of the same Heritage Department. Interesting, the same Heritage Minister Guilbeault now that announced that ridiculous censorship when the mainstream media got down his back. Notice it's the Heritage Minister where M103 came from. Other dots to connect.
Wow.
Let's talk about money, because I think a good part of your message tonight was about money. The Middle East is loaded. The Prince Walid bin Talal is one of the richest men in the world. We're talking about, he is probably richer than Mike Bloomberg. I mean, he's in the top 5 in the entire world. So he provides money. You mentioned Islamic finance in Canada. 4% population penetration, in my mind, is scary. To have $180 billion in mortgages in the economic bloodstream of a nation, meaning all your major banks in Canada, many major Canadian banks operate in the United States, are knee-deep in money from the Middle East coming in and going out. Then you connect another dot. You mentioned Georgetown University. Georgetown University is drowning in bin Talal's money, in other people's money. $20 million is nothing. The same gentleman gave that same amount of money to Harvard. Approximately at the same time, Harvard accepted Barack Obama into their union. It's just incredible. The Georgetown University, so we talk about the deep state, and we talked about earlier, the deep state goes all the way down to your local state, offices in your state. But it also includes the universities, and Georgetown University is there as the leading university in the nation's capital. They train the Foreign Service. They have an office in Qatar. Georgetown University has a complete campus to train Foreign Service people from all over the world at Georgetown in Qatar. They don't pay a dime. The Emir of Qatar and the Qatar government pays 100% for every light bulb and every watt of electricity in that college campus. So for these people to identify any objectivity is a joke. And the fact that they want to undo the Holy Land trial, which was about money. They convicted people for moving $12 million to Hamas. So this deep state is related to money. And these examples are just, I mean, they're sad and they're laughable at the same time.
Yeah, we're losing, unfortunately. But we do have in America Trump in power. That's a statement unto itself.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I agree. The forces that want to take him out are so overwhelming. It'll be interesting to see how the rest of the year goes on. I've got one other comment, and then I'm sure we've got.
Well, before you go into that, I just,
Yep.
I think we need to mention, when you talk about Sharia finance in Canada, it's all across the United States as well. It's major banks that are involved with it. Bank of America, let's see, Barclays, Bloomberg, Citibank. There's so many that are involved with Sharia finance. Go out to Sharia Finance Watch and you'll see this whole list. Citibank, I think I mentioned, Dow Jones, Deutsche Bank, Deloitte, Credit Suisse, even Coca-Cola. Guys, I mean, this is big. It is not just simply small banks providing, Sharia finance loans and insurances. It is so much money that is going through this and getting funneled into terrorism.
Yep, that's it.
Yeah. Sorry, I just had to bring that
No,
in.
I'm glad you did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I got one last one, and appreciate people's patience. You mentioned the guy from Hungary, Orban, and you mentioned the International Religious Freedom Alliance, and that's a big deal, a big step in the right direction. The challenge, though, is the people behind that, of course, the President of the United States, Mike Pence, Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and his ambassador for religious freedom. His name is Sam Brownback. And that's all good. However, Brownback and Pence are also in favor of the Abrahamic Family Center, which is the building of in complexes in the Middle East, but eventually and probably in Toronto and Michigan, a single land property that has a mosque, a church, and a synagogue on it. And one of the people that Mike Pence sent Brownback to visit with is the Pope. So the Pope is all over the Abrahamic faith. We're going to have a whole webinar on that with Liz Yore in March on the 17th. But I guess the point I'm making here is we seem to have a little bit of schizophrenia in good people like Mike Pompeo. He has Sam Brownback doing good things and very evil things in terms of building the energy between one world Abrahamic Family Center, which is another way of saying one world religion, etc. So just a comment on that.
I'll tell you one thing that I heard an Israeli government minister call these kinds of relationships. He called them iceberg relationships, because even though Saudi Arabia is behind the funding of Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood organizations that are out to destroy Israel, ironically, Israel is doing business with Saudi Arabia. And we see the American leader, Trump, doing business with Saudi Arabia. You have these iceberg relationships in this global, what they call a global village. And sometimes they're just negotiated to set up camps simply because there are people out there like the Iranian regime folk. And it ends up being like a game, a bitter game of chess, where these groups, these alliances together, you wonder, what are they doing allying themselves with these types of people? Because the Pope has taken that as his mission to form this alliance with Islam, to work along with the worst leaders, including the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar, who promotes, according to Islamic jurisprudence and normative Islam, the Sharia law. And what is the Pope doing this for? The stuff that this guy supports, including open door immigration, where he's walled up in the Vatican in safety. Right. He has facilitated the red-green axis, which is communism and Islamism. He is facilitating this, and yet you see that there's some alliances with folks where you say, what are they doing with these people? But that's because there's this sort of global where people say, okay, I'll be a good sport, I'll meet with the Pope, I'll meet with this one, I'll meet with that one. I'm not going to come out and say, well, I'm just not going to meet with them. And this is what we're having. But more and more we could see how the world is getting and how far it's drifting toward that communism and Islamism. And it's going to get to a point where it's going to become so obvious, which it is already in my view, but not in everybody's view. And it's going to become so in your face that some of these relationships are going to have to be renegotiated.
Well, we want to get to the questions, Q&A from our attendees.
Already.
Yes. All right. I was just waiting for
on
that.
Mary.
Well, all right. Kathy's asking, and she says, you've touched on this a little bit last time, but is the USA northern border now or becoming as vulnerable as our southern border?
I would say so, definitely. I mean, it's a different kind of a problem we see in the southern border. We have these caravans coming in. We've got the problems with illegals coming through, although Canada had some of that too. But you need to understand that Canada is on to the UN Migration Pact, and the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada is huge. So in some ways it's worse because it's more insidious. It's more stealth than we see with the southern border. It's very frightening, actually. Not, you know, I'm not here today to scare people, but I'm here to scare people at the same time into reality. This is what's happening. Now, we saw what was going on under the Obama administration, and happily, luckily, Trump got elected. We don't know what the future holds in Canada in terms of elections, but with what Trudeau is doing, what he's clear about, it is frightening.
Well, I would also add to that if I could. I remember watching, there was a gentleman, and I don't think he's doing much anymore, but Dennis Michael Lynch. Do you remember some of the videos he used to do? He went down to the southern border, but he also went across a lot of the locations on the northern border where he showed where you just simply either walk across the ice when it's a frozen lake or river, or you can literally walk from this side to that side, and there is nothing in terms of barrier. There is nothing in terms of a stand for border patrol. There is nothing. They just simply walk across. So if the northern border is
easy to get across.
So
I've seen it. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's everywhere. It's all across Canada.
Sure.
Canada is double the length of that southern border. Canada is, the northern is double.
Yep. So, all right, we've got Jill asking, she says, 4% is huge. Are you sure? So do you have any kind of locations that we could drive her to shows that statistic?
We're going to have to go and look up. If you look at Statistics Canada, you will find verification on what that population is. And not only will you find the verification of what the number is, but you'll also find distribution of where the different groups are within Canada, what province and so forth. So Statistics Canada will verify that number. I was giving the report from the Gulf News, which I know that Shariah Finance is taking off. I know the CTV report showed up, the expanse of migration of immigrants coming in per year. But in terms of the 4%, you could look that up in Statistics Canada. They will give you exact figures and where.
Good, thank you. All right. Any ideas on whether the Conservatives will take back M103?
I would hope so. From what I hear, rumors, and I know rumors are huge, I would hope and I would think so. There's something though that we need to keep in mind about the Conservatives. There was a petition called E411 in Canada, which formed the basis of M103. And E411 was as bad as M103 because it formed the basis. The Conservatives at the time didn't realize what this was. When certain groups, and Jihad Watch was one, started writing about it, and Rebel Media was covering it too, there were few of us doing it. Then people started to take note, what's going on here? And people started to pressure the Conservatives, why are you voting? Why did you vote for E411? Because they did. And they were told to do it by Rona Ambrose. I was told at the time that she cautioned them to do so. Now, I was told this by what I consider a reliable source, but it's hearsay, that they were ordered to do it. We saw Patrick Brown in Ontario, a Conservative, that went along with this Islamophobia thing in Ontario provincially, and we saw E411 federally. But when the news got out about, hey, watch out for M103, what this is about. If you look at it and you look at the meaning of it and you look at the definition provided by the NCCM of what Islamophobia is, and it talks about, and they talk about hatred or dislike for elements of Islam, it kind of gets crazy. And people started to get worried and say, we shouldn't be supporting this M103. So all of the Conservative MPs, with an exception to 2, ended up voting against M103. So given that, I would think that should the conservatives come into power again, they may strike it down. They will not, I'm hoping so, because there's also word in Canada that the Muslim Brotherhood interests have also infiltrated the conservative camp because of fear, because this is what's been going on. Islamophobia, Islamophobia, you say anything that they think you shouldn't say, Islamophobia, Islamophobia, you're a racist. So this scares people. And from what I hear, it's been, and I've seen some of it, it's been influencing the conservative camp. So I could only hope that they would strike it down, because right now it's leaderless. We don't know who's going to be the leader. We don't know if this person's going to be brave enough to stand up to these propagandist lies. We could only hope. But there's also the People Party of Canada that's also vying for leadership in Canada, and they seem to have a much better handle of it, but they don't have any history to prove leadership in Canada. So to the question, will the Conservatives reverse it? That will depend on the strength of the new leader of the Conservative Party. Based on history, they most likely will, but we don't know who that leader is going to be, and we don't know how infiltrated the Conservative Party is. So I hope that helps somewhat.
Yes.
Christine, I've got a quick follow-up, Mary, if I could.
Well, I wanted to follow up real quick from what she just said. When is the next election cycle where that could turn around and become so?
Now, elections are 4 years, but now I don't know why. I heard some rumor it could be 2. So right now that's kind of up in the air. We have a minority government, and I don't know why somebody suggested to me 2, but it should be 4 years.
Okay. Okay.
Because we had one in 15, one in 19, it should be the next 4 years. I don't know why. I heard a significant person say 2. I have no idea why.
Okay.
All right, I apologize for interrupting. I guess what I was trying to connect the dot for Christine and Mary is, if Trump is in office in 21 to 24, that might be a better chance, might make for a better chance for conservatives in Canada to recognize his behavior, to align themselves with him, to gain some traction. Is that fair? In other words, if Trump is out of the picture, I would think it would be much harder for the conservatives in Canada to mount an offensive to get rid of the Trudeau government.
Well, you guys, well, you've got a point, because you guys in America, although you have the First Amendment, you still have a lot of problems cracking down on people who come out and try to tell the truth, on truth tellers. You have a similar problem as we have in Canada, not as bad under Trump, of course. But if Trump ended up losing, there will be such a crackdown, and I'm talking like never before, on truth tellers in the States. So people simply won't be getting the same kind of news, even with the alternative media on the internet, because they'll likely, looking at the madness going on in the Democratic Party, looking at that kind of madness, they'll go after the internet. The problem is, it will become more and more totalitarian, so that will affect the news. And as a result, it will affect the information getting out there, because I believe in bottom up. Some people believe in top down. I believe in bottom up. People sometimes lose hope, but they're the ones putting in leaders into power. So we need to consider people watching, people listening to the news, people reading and who want information and know what's going on. It's important to get out there and vote. But should that happen in the US, I think it's inevitable. It will affect Canada, if even on the information going out. Even in Canada right now, you got to be careful what you say in Canada, because there are a lot of people under lawfare right now as I speak. There are a lot of people that I know that's under lawfare. So if that happens to you guys in America, God help us. The Muslim Brotherhood plan for North America will be on its way. It's already on its way, but it will be more complete. And you'll have the communist factor weighing in as well, impacting as well.
Well, we've got a comment from Teresa that I thought I'd keep and read to you. She wanted to know if we had any address for President Orban, so she could thank him for his policies. Said, my late grandfather was Hungarian, and I know the people of Hungary suffered under communism and will never let that happen to them again. I don't think we've got a contact for him, but the
best thing she could do is look up the government of Hungary and send an email based on that, on what is for public eyes. That would be the best thing, because I know that governments do read emails. Excellent. I know that, yes.
Thank you. And we got one from Mitch. Thank you, Christine, for bringing up Sharia financing. Perhaps next time you report, you will be able to talk about the connection of the current FBI director comes from a law that specializes in Sharia finance. I'm not sure I understand that. Talk about the connection of the current FBI director coming from a law that specializes. I don't know.
He might have meant a law school there. I think
that's what I'm thinking. Okay. Probably somebody who specializes in Sharia finance.
Mitch is talking about the fact that American law schools are now teaching Sharia law. We know for a fact a Jesuit college
Yeah.
Detroit, University of Detroit, teaches Sharia
Uh-oh.
law and gets internships for law students at CARE. So I
Well, that
think
would
the
make
point,
sense. It makes perfect sense because if you look at the Bridge Initiative and what it's doing, it's hook, line, and sinker, working with the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is what we need to absorb, that when you start looking at the pattern of what is happening, it would make perfect sense that it is happening across the board. This is a trend that we see. Even at Harvard, for that girl that to be treated like that, just for merely asking a question, and for her to be chased out, harassed, abused, is abhorrent. And this is something that we're seeing on campuses in Canada too, where Jewish students are being intimidated. At a university in Toronto, at York, I believe it was, Jewish students were spat on. Now, if this government is talking about hate, 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 and cracking down on hate, it's not cracking down on that kind of hate. It's only cracking down on what it calls hate, which is not hate at all. I mean, I do not advocate picking on Muslims, attacking Muslims. I do not advocate any kind of discrimination against religion, against any person, but to criticize a faith, to criticize its ideology, that is perfectly allowed. And the government is cracking down on what is allowed in our Constitution and ignoring real instances of violence and inciting violence against the Jewish community. That is appalling.
Yeah. Well, we've got a very special prayer being given to Canadians to be able to be free and feel that they have the freedom that they need to live. So
a lot of that's needed.
From Patricia. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you, Patricia.
And I thanked her as well. Let's see, they're popping in quickly now. They said, oh, 2 years. I think this person's addressing your 2 years versus 4 years. They said 2 because as soon as the Conservatives have a new leader, they want to overthrow Trudeau. Well,
that's possible, but I know that there are also election laws and rules. But the person that indicated that to me, I kind of scratched my head because I said, there are laws, and we usually go every 4 years, but maybe there's some exception here that's going on behind the scenes. So it's a possibility. I just thought I'd mention it just in case it ends up being 2 years. So that people say, well, Christine said it was 4. It's supposed to be 4, but we
probably wishful thinking.
But nobody's planning on nobody's planning on impeaching Trudeau.
I wish somebody would.
Yeah. Do they even have impeachment in Canada? I suppose they do.
A person could end up with a vote in their own party of non-confidence and get thrown out.
There you go.
Possibility. So
we'll get everybody praying for that. How's that?
Sounds good to me.
All right.
I hate you Christians anyway. They're the worst part.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
right.
And I'll pray about it.
Yeah. All right. So, Dick, you mentioned what school did you mention teaching Sharia?
University of Detroit.
University of Detroit. Okay.
Devastating.
Jesuit. By the way, it is a Jesuit university.
It is.
As is Georgetown.
Isn't that where Keith Ellison came from? That's where Keith Ellison came from.
And the Pope comes from the Jesuit background.
Exactly. So
it once had a good history.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The Jesuits and many of the seminaries in Catholicism were infiltrated by the leftists, and they've done a remarkable job. They've got really bright people with the wrong issues. If you take bright people and you associate them with the devil, a lot of really bad things happen, and I'm afraid that's what happened.
Yeah. Well, that's it. All of the questions. Thank you, Christine. This was just an amazing presentation. And
thank you, Mary.
I think I'm going to go search the no-fly list and see if we've got Qatar. What's his last name?
Omar Qatar.
Omar Qatar. I'm going to see if he's on the no-fly list for the United States.
Yeah.
Well, we're almost finished. Hang on for a second. If we can, we'll be done in just a moment. We want to remind you that this is just a picture I found today, and I think it fits. Christine has been telling us about the guy on the right. We've been hearing a lot about the man on the left. They're about, I don't know, probably 30 or 40 years apart. I'm guessing they both made trips to communist countries and had nice things to say about them. So just something to take away.
And they're friends with and friends with George Soros.
Yeah.
There you go. So wow, that's scary. We do have a webinar tomorrow night, everybody. This one is particularly interesting because our co-founder, the man that got Marion and I into this, David Boris, our police chief and retired police chief and co-founder for Sharia Crime Stoppers, is going to have a very serious topic tomorrow night, same station, from Pensacola, where there were dead people, to Hezbollah, the threats inside the wire. In other words, we've just heard about Canada. We're going to hear a lot tomorrow about sleeper cells in America. I don't think you want to miss that. And as always, everything that David talks about is highly cited and documented, so you can look into everything that we talk about tomorrow night. Mary, you have any closing comments? And then we'll ask Christine for a closing comment.
No, all of this information, Christine, is just so critical for people to understand. And I have to say that you being a part of Jihad Watch is critical to be able to explain what's going on on the northern border, and then what's going on in the United States as well. You have such a broad knowledge of everything that you bring to the table. It's really amazing. And thank you for all of the work that you do with this.
And thank you for everything that you are doing, Mary and Dick. It's very important. And thank you for everybody that tuned in to watch our broadcast tonight as well.
All right, with that, we'll say good night. You can have a good night's sleep and get some exercise tomorrow. And then don't forget to come back tomorrow night, David Boris, 7 p.m. Eastern. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.